If you look at the data this way, which I've done with a group that I work with, if you go back and look at all of the articles that there have been with these pills, all of the clinical trials that have been done, going back to 1983. Now, FDA referred to this article extensively in this here. What they don't refer to is this, that if you add up all of the suicidal acts in all of the placebo-controlled trials that had happened and look at is there an increased risk, what you find is from 88, 2 years before the first case reports on Prozac causing problems, that the clinical trial data show that there was an almost threefold increase in risk in people going on to a suicidal act. Back when the FDA had their hearings 15 years ago, they didn't do the science. They didn't go back and get all of the articles that had actually been published and have a look at what the data showed. And they don't refer to that fact when they refer to this article in this particular document. What Dr. Loughran doesn't actually refer to in this document at all, he refers to loads of articles which show there's no risk at all, including one article by him which has the data coded like this. He says there's all these articles which have shown that there is no increase in risk. And even though he knows that the data were miscoded this way, you wouldn't find a hint of that in here. So let me just bring you back. This is, again, data you've seen from both Joe and Vera. If you look at the data in here on people going on to clear behaviors, that is, they either actually harm themselves or they end up dead, this is what the FDA data in here actually shows. There's an increase in risk. FDA have hidden this by looking at, by including in the mix data on people who claim to have thoughts of harming themselves. Now, what you need to know is how clinical trials back then worked. 15 to 16 years ago, when these clinical trials were done, or earlier, what happens is people weren't clued as to the fact that there could be this risk. If you aren't told to look out for it, well, you don't look out for it. They were asked to rate how the patients did using the Hamilton rating scale. This is a clinical rating scale that is not actually made to pick up whether people have actually become actively suicidal or not. It's the kind of thing that the average person running a clinical trial back then would have used as a checklist. They'd have asked you a bunch of things about your sleep and things like that. They may have often asked them without the rating scale there with them. They'd have just asked them because they know these are the things that are on the rating scale. After they'd asked them perhaps reasonably well during the first week of the trial, and they'd pick up the fact that yes, you aren't sleeping, and yes, you're a little bit suicidal. After that, when you come in to the person who ran the clinical trial, what you'd actually see is they'd look at you, walk into the room, and you seem to be a little bit brighter and things like that, and they'd globally get a feel of are you better or worse and things like that. And they fill up the rating scale after you've left often, usually without asking you the questions. They'll rate globally. So what you get in terms of whether this person is actually thinking about being suicidal or not is they'll assume you aren't because just you seem to be a little bit better. Okay? So what you've got is data there. When the FDA throw this into the mix, it's non-data. It's data based on people who probably didn't ask the question, have you any increase in thoughts of actually harming yourself? This is the data on age, which I'll just skip through because you've seen this. Let me pick up a further issue, which is this. This is a particular paper that FDA also refer to in here. And it's the idea that the rates of completed suicides here in the US have fallen since this group of drugs have been used. Now, if drugs like Prozac, which you see here in blue, are being used and cause people to go on to kill themselves, surely the rate of suicide in the US would have gone up and not gone down. This is an extremely powerful argument, really. But if you look at this journal article, which is the one that's actually specifically referred to by FDA, what you see is that the rate of suicide in the US before the release of Prozac had been falling anyway. Whatever the reasons for that are, we aren't sure, but I'm going to give you one hint as to what it could be. Let me show you the data from Sweden, which looks a bit the same as the data from here. I can also show you the data from Finland, Denmark, Norway, Ireland, whatever, and it all looks a bit the same as this, and I'm sure the issues that lead to the data looking this way over in Sweden and in the US are just the same. What you see there in red is the degree of sales of these drugs. What you see toward the end of the 80s is that as the SSRI group of drugs comes on stream, that the sales of the antidepressants go up. And you see at the same time that there's a slow fall in the rate of people over in Sweden going on to complete suicide. However, if you look back in the graph, you see that there's been a fall which goes back to probably the mid-70s. Whatever is leading the Swedes not to commit suicide, it's probably not the use of these pills. What could it be? Or even, are the Swedes actually not committing suicide? Well, have a look at this. If you look at the post-mortems the Swedes have been doing, that's in red there, you see it falls. And it falls over the same period of time as the rate of suicide falls over in Sweden. There's a much closer link between whether the Swedes are doing post-mortems or not and the declared rate of suicide than there is with the actual kind of consumption of the drugs. What you also see there in black is that as they don't do post-mortems, that there's an increased rate in them actually returning verdicts of deaths that are ill-defined. They're just unsure what the actual cause of death is. If you add the rate of suicide and the rate of ill-defined death actually together, you find it's going up, not down. In the US, since the mid-80s, when you used to do postmortems on 50% of the people that died, you've dropped to 5% now. You cannot make a diagnosis of actual suicide reliably without doing postmortems. And this is a further issue. No, I'll skip that. That's an extra technical detail. Let me just skip quickly on to this, and this is the end. This report refers to 2 or 3 articles by this authorship group here who work for an institution that Dr. Loughran used to work for. They used to be colleagues. And the authors here looked at the data on completed suicides just in the clinical trials of people who were anxious, lodged with the FDA. The interesting thing about this article here was the idea that, FDA had been saying, and the field had been saying, look, people who are depressed can also go on to commit suicide. How do you tease out the risk from the pills from the risk that's posed by the illness? Well, there is a way to do it, which is to look at groups of people who haven't got the illness, like people who go on these pills and who are anxious. People who are anxious don't usually commit suicide. Or at least that's what we thought, and that's what these authors thought before they went into the FDA database and found, I think, 12 suicides we'll actually see on the next slide. That's more suicides just in the clinical trials of people who are anxious than in the whole of this report, okay? So the authors conclude, we found, much to our surprise, that people who are anxious are much more likely to go on to commit suicide than we had thought. Do you want to see what the data looks like that they based that conclusion on? There it is. That's the people going on to commit suicide who are anxious. every single case of suicide was in a person who was on the drugs. 0 people who were in the clinical trials who were taking the placebo went on to commit suicide. It takes a tremendous bias to read that data as good evidence that the illness causes the problem rather than the pills. Thank you.